International Studies. My name is Daniel Sargent with Susan Hyde. I'm the co-director of the Institute. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to all of you this afternoon Mark Clifford, who is the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, the former executive director of the Asia Business Council, and a former board member at Next Digital, the publisher of Hong Kong's former largest pro-democracy newspaper, Apple Daily. Mark Clifford has also served as editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong newspaper, and as publisher and editor-in-chief of The Standard, another Hong Kong newspaper. He has held senior editorial positions at Business Week and at the Far Eastern Economic Review in both Hong Kong and Seoul. Mark Clifford is also, and this is especially important, a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, from which he graduated, also very important, with honors in history. After Berkeley, he went on to be a Walter Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University before receiving his PhD in history from the University of Hong Kong, where he lived and worked from 1987 until 2021. With that, I would like to thank the Human Rights Center of Berkeley Law for co-sponsoring this event with us. I'd like to thank, where's Linda? Linda Meyerson for all her work putting this event together. Please, all of you join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Clifford to Berkeley.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I mean, it's really nice to be here. I was just walking around the campus. I haven't been here for quite a while, and it's, one of the world's great universities. So I'm honored to be with you, and thank everybody for helping organize this. So as we discussed, and I guess is your usual format, I'll speak for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. The title is Hong Kong and Human Rights: Why Human Rights Should Take Center Stage on China Policies. It's a somewhat bifurcated title deliberately. As you indicated, I actually lived in Hong Kong from 1992. I was in Korea for 5 years before that. So 28 years in Hong Kong. My work now is focused on Hong Kong and on human rights work in Hong Kong. As you said, I was director at Next Digital. I have 7 colleagues in jail right now, and I'm obviously a very personal stake in seeing that they get out, and a very personal interest in these issues. So the structure is I'm going to go talk quite broadly for 20 minutes or so about China and human rights, and then narrow it down to Hong Kong for the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, and we can have more of a dialogue. So I start with the standpoint that relations between the U.S. and China are likely to deteriorate, even in an optimistic scenario. But that I think we need to work, as Americans need to ensure that our representatives, our policymakers, our whole society puts human rights more at the center, makes it a core principle as we engage with China. And I think human rights issues have been kind of sometimes more, sometimes less over the last 51 years since Nixon went to China and we started engaging with the People's Republic of China. So I'm going to focus on Hong Kong as it's a place with a unique international role. And I think that China's unnecessary and brutal crackdown there shows that its strategy, and this is my latest book today, Hong Kong, Tomorrow, the World, what China's crackdown reveals about its plans to end freedom everywhere. And I think I'd like to talk to you a little more about that. So let me start with adversarial Sino-US relations. I think we're in for a long struggle ahead. I mean, I don't think we're trying to remake China. I think the days of, missionaries and even I think the kind of naive optimism of the 1990s or early 2000s about somehow the end of history in China being remade in a kind of more Western liberal model are past us. I think that was it was an assumption and a policy that didn't work out. Nothing wrong with that. Countries can have different systems, but I think we face a country that wants to rewrite the rules-based international order in its own image, in a fundamentally illiberal image, with no freedom of speech, press, assembly, etc. And that China's ambitions don't stop at its borders. Clearly, it wants Taiwan, and I think that's going to be the kind of area we really need to focus on and ensure that war doesn't break out. I mean, it's a very imperfect analogy, but obviously Ukraine showed, which started a year ago this week, showed that deterrence didn't work. We have to ensure that deterrence works and we don't have war again in East Asia. But I'm concerned that China is back to its a new kind of Mach 2 version of what it engaged in the 1950s and 1960s, which is trying to export its system beyond its border. And we can talk more about the ways that it does that. But I think that's why it is a threat, not only to the US, but to liberal democracies everywhere. As I said, I think our goal has to be, as we think about policy and we think about human rights, we think about the US and China, we want to avoid military confrontation. But I would argue that a more aggressive posture of deterrence, and I'm going to focus on human rights, lessens the chance of war. But what I want to start this with is to, where I come from, that we have a populist, well-armed, increasingly militarized adversary with an ideology that's strikingly at odds with ours, one that presents a menace to Taiwan, but really to all of East Asia. And it's, of course, has a sizable economy, about 3/4 the size of the US, that makes it very different from the situation the US faced with the Soviet Union. So it's closer to a peer competitor than the USSR was. It's, as I said, its economy is about $18 trillion versus the US's $23 trillion. I mean, this is, it's obviously a very, very populous country with a long and I guess you'd say proud civilization. I mean, one that the world should really look to. It doesn't have to be like this, but under the Chinese Communist Party, I think that's what we're stuck with. We tried engagement with China over a period of decades, notably with bringing China into first giving it most favored nation status, and then bringing it into the World Trade Organization, as well as many other global organizations, World Health Organization being a notable one. The US has run sizable trade deficits with China, helping build up the Chinese economy. And yet China remains haunted by a fear of disintegration and collapse. The collapse of the USSR was really a seminal event, I think, to the current leadership in China. They have blamed the US for the Tiananmen uprising, if you want to call it that, in 1989 that resulted in the deaths of hundreds, if not more than 1,000 young Chinese. Today, China is not only the world's second largest economy, dominant power in East Asia, but is also, by most measures, the most significant violator of human rights in the world. We have the situation in Tibet, which has been going on for 7 decades. In Xinjiang, we have the largest internment of civilians since the Nazi period. In the South China Sea, despite Xi Jinping promising President Obama in the Rose Garden at the White House that the South China Sea would not be militarized. It's now a militarized area that China is trying to deny freedom of navigation to other countries. And of course, we have the city where I live, Hong Kong, that I'll talk more about, but I think we had a completely unnecessary, over-the-top crackdown in Hong Kong that's seen, well, today more than 1,300 political prisoners, over 10,000 people arrested on political charges, and the destruction of free press, civil society, independent judiciary, with freedom of worship, on the target. The proximate cause of any kind of tension or increased continuing tension between the US and China is Taiwan, which China, of course, claims is should be part of the People's Republic of China, that it's not another country, and that China can and will take Taiwan back, and that would not be an illegitimate takeover. I think that the underlying causes are much deeper, as I've hinted at. China under Xi Jinping is a totalitarian state that wants to control dissent, both within, and this is I think what's really important, without its borders. In the work that I do throughout the UK and in the US, I've talked to numerous Chinese, obviously especially Hong Kongers, given my work. We've been harassed by Chinese agents and United Front people working in concert with the Chinese government. We have seen well-documented cases of, in San Francisco, we have the father of an Olympic figure skater. Down in Southern California, who was harassed and threatened by Chinese agents. We have an arson attack on a Chinese sculptor down in Southern California, with a political candidate in Long Island, where I live, who was the target of a number of plots against by the Chinese against him to keep him, he was Chinese, Tiananmen survivor, keep him from running for U.S. Congress. My friend and colleague Benedict Rogers, an activist in the UK, has his neighbors were told by the Chinese embassy to spy on him. He's been threatened with arrest. His organization's website has been shut down in Hong Kong. He's been told that he's subject to the national security law in Hong Kong, which essentially outlaws dissent, even though he's a British citizen living in London. So I think China is unambiguously a threat to freedom everywhere. We talk more about this because I know that's a somewhat controversial statement, but I think its aggressive campaign to shut dissent, not only in its own country, but in the US, UK, and other places, is a clear and present danger to open societies everywhere. It's an expansionist, it's a revisionist power, and of course we can see this in the case of Taiwan, but I think we can see throughout East Asia where they've tried to punish went even through into Australia. Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID. China responded by shutting down its purchases of many Australian goods and hurt Australia's exporters very severely. So I think if we've learned anything from Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's that we ignore dictators at our peril. As I said, deterrence failed in the case of Ukraine. We can't let it fail in the case of Taiwan. So let me turn to having, I think, laid out how I feel about the PRC, and I hasten to add, unfortunately, it's necessary that we can't let this focus on the Chinese Communist Party be conflated with either Chinese people in China or Chinese people outside of Hong Kong. And there is a danger, and certainly has happened in the U.S., that this shades into an anti-Chinese racism, and that's the last thing that I want. And I think it's the last thing that any of us who care about the CCP should want. So I'm sorry I need to even say that, but that's the reality. Human rights, I think, are an indispensable part of the campaign that we're waging for free and open societies, and my case for freedom for my colleagues and others who are political prisoners in Hong Kong. Let me talk a little bit about why I think human rights should be an important part of our China policy, and they're strategic reasons, practical reasons, and moral reasons. So morally, I think most of us would agree that people shouldn't be locked up just for saying what they think, or for not having children, going to a church of their choice, loving who they want. Human rights is really about a concern for the integrity and dignity of every individual. It's a fundamental tenet of open societies. It's what sets us apart in many ways. I'm sorry, though, that the Chinese Communist Party they talk about the people, but they have no respect for individuals. And I know so many people who just have been ground up, spit out, imprisoned, tortured, had their lives wrecked by the Chinese Communist Party for doing nothing other than the kinds of activities that we engage with in Berkeley every day on a campus like this. They have outlawed any form of dissent. I mean, one of the saddest cases was Dr. Li Wenjiang, who was one of the first people in Wuhan to raise the alarm about COVID. Nobody even knew what it was then. He ended up dying of COVID, but in the meantime, he had been forced to sign by police to sign a confession. I mean, it's that kind of disrespect for the individual, which is not only bad for the individual, but I would argue ultimately bad for societies as a whole. There are also legal, foundations to this. China is a signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, one of the main authors of it was Chinese. It's a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Chinese, the PRC Constitution promises fundamental freedoms. And in the case of Hong Kong, we can go into this in great detail, China made repeated, detailed promises both to the British in the Sino-British Declaration of 1984, an international treaty that was lodged at the UN, as well as in the Basic Law, which is the mini constitution that China promulgated, promising the people of Hong Kong that they would continue to enjoy the same civil freedoms they had, that they would enjoy increased, expanded political freedoms, including universal suffrage, and that they would enjoy a high degree of autonomy and their continued freedoms, their way of life for 50 years after the Chinese resumption of sovereignty in 1997. So I think there's a legal basis, and I think the fact that China has so shamelessly violated its promises, its international promises, its promises to the British, its promises to the people of Hong Kong, and it's done this shamelessly. It said, funny, I studied history, they say, well, it's just a historical document, it doesn't matter, it's just words. And I think that's, that speaks volumes to China's attitude towards, not only towards freedom, but towards its promises to the international community. And of course, when I say China, I'm talking about the People's Republic of China. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party. And third, I guess on a functional basis, not just because human rights speaks to something that's deeply human, to shared aspirations, but because a focus on human rights undercuts the Chinese Communist Party's ability to hold on to power. Because ongoing human rights abuses, violent suppression of basic freedom underscores, underpins, makes possible the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to rule without fear, without power, without the threat that they will lock up, criminalize any form of opposition or dissent. They would have a harder time staying in power. So actually appealing to our better angels, to our better natures, to appealing to what's good about open societies and individual liberties is good in itself. It's good from a legal sense, and it's good in a functional sense because it undercuts the CCP, who, as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of. So the moral, the legal, the functional, I think this summarizes why it's justifiable and effective to have human rights as a key component to our policy with China. But for too long, it's been an underdeveloped part of U.S. foreign policy. So I'm going to argue for its importance, I would say tab, and talk about some of the ways that we're putting this into practice with regard to Hong Kong specifically. So just spend a couple minutes talking about, very schematically, you can think of foreign policy as having three legs of a stool. There's the kind of hard power, political, military power, diplomatic power, managing conflict from a state perspective, trying to set up guardrails, deterrence. That's whether with allies or competitors. I think when Anthony Blinken meets with Wang Yi in Munich to talk about these issues, that's kind of that leg of the stool. There's the business side, and of course that's been very, very important in thinking about China. The business community waged an unprecedented, U.S. business community waged an unprecedented campaign to get China into the World Trade Organization. There was a belief, I think, among many of us, including me, that trade and engagement would bind countries together and make it more likely that freedom or that a liberal international order or some version of it was going to develop, and to lessen the chances of conflict. That these thickening ties would lead to greater prosperity for all, and with prosperity would come freedom. And there's a lot of academic literature particularly in the 1990s that posited for a relationship between economic growth, development of the middle class, development of greater individual and political freedoms. As somebody who lived in Korea from 1987 to 1992, I definitely believe that. I saw Korea go from a very authoritarian place to, vibrant democracy. When I moved to Korea in '87, Taiwan was still under martial law, and today Taiwan is one of the most vibrant, open, democratic, remarkable places in the world. But it turns out that business and economic ties did not necessarily lead to political openness. But I think the political, military, or that hard side, and the business side have dominated. Again, if you think of it as a three-legged stool, it's kind of an unstable stool. And I would say that stool would be more powerful, stronger, more stable if human rights were added and strengthened. And I think, as I said, this emphasis on human rights underscores what sets liberal, open societies, however imperfectly these are put into practice, apart from the kind of nasty, brutish, short lives that Hobbes envisioned for us all. And then we moved beyond those years. And as I said, it undercuts the CCP's claim to legitimacy for the power of the state, and I think from the CCP's perspective, the meaninglessness of any individual human life. I think, in the end, as we look back historically, whatever any of us think about domestic policies of Ronald Reagan or Maggie Thatcher, their clarity, their moral clarity in calling out the human rights abuses and worse really of the Soviet Union proved to be very, very effective. And I know I've talked to former Soviet political prisoners and of course former Chinese political prisoners. This moral clarity in the West is not being afraid to speak truth to power, but also to say what's really going on and say how wrong it is really important. It's important for the people who are behind bars. I talked recently to Nathan Sharansky, who was in the Gulag for 9 years, about the importance of support in the West, and especially on the part of political leaders. So I'd like to see more of that here. I think, you know, in our own way, you know, we've had two very different presidents, the current one and the previous one, but I think we're seeing a shift towards greater clarity in U.S. policy towards China, and a move away from I guess engagement that sometimes has veered into kind of mollycoddling. I mean, because, you know, not to act emboldens dictators. I think we can see with Putin, you know, something similar is happening with Xi Jinping. You know, dictators break treaties, they break promises, and by the way, that spills over into businesses, which we can talk about in the case of Hong Kong. So in Russia, the world, you know, didn't do too much when Russia went into Georgia, when they went into Crimea, when they nibbled away at Ukraine a few years ago, when the MH17 plane was shot down. And I would say the same thing, and then we see the result, which is a land war in Europe, the first land war since 1945. And as I said before, and I'll repeat, we must forestall this in East Asia because the consequences are potentially so much worse for in terms of human suffering, human death, and I guess more prosaic basis for economies as well. So let me move on to Hong Kong. I think I've laid out the big picture sufficiently. So as I said, Hong Kong was promised 50 years of autonomy after 1997. There were, you know, very granular and detailed promises of continued civil and political freedom. As I said, there was a promise that Hong Kong would move towards universal suffrage. It had a system is a bit like the Electoral College here. There was a lot of indirect representation. But if you listen to China, you make it sound like there was almost a revolution in Hong Kong, or you think that you know, they were trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. And really, all the Hong Kong people wanted was to be able to elect effectively the mayor and the city council. I mean, it was pretty small bore stuff. And yet, the Chinese Communist Party seemed unwilling to allow for Hong Kong to continue with its policies of openness. So you had continued resistance, and I'll just mention 3 particular times. So the handover from 156 years of British colonial rule came in 1997. 6 years later, to the day, actually, coincidentally, in 2003, something like 500,000 people took to the streets to protect national security legislation that I think they quite rightly realized would be used to crack down on political protests. So 500,000 people out of a city of 7.5 million people. It's a lot of people. I mean, unlike the US, where if you have a demonstration in Washington, you get people from around the country. I mean, you were not getting people from mainland China. This was 500,000 people out of a little more than 7 million. Then in 2014, was a much more, and it resulted in, the bill was withdrawn. The chief executive, the mayor, effectively resigned a year later, supposedly for health reasons. But there wasn't any positive move towards electoral reform. In 2014, the so-called umbrella movement, or Occupy Central, saw the city center and around the legislative council and government headquarters occupied for 79 days. Very peaceful, ended peacefully, but with no change. So, you know, but you had a situation where in every single open election in Hong Kong, roughly 60%, more or less 6 out of every 10 people would vote for the pro-democracy candidates. It didn't really matter what was happening. From 1991, and I should add parenthetically, the British were very slow, and they also bear some responsibility in not bringing in democracy earlier. We can talk about that in the Q&A and why that happened. But you had a lot of people who were supporting more democratization. And but you know, again, I have to give both sides credit. I mean, the occupation was right in the middle of the city. It was in fact adjacent to one of the main buildings occupied by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. The PLA did not come out and shoot the people of Hong Kong. They didn't run them over with tanks, but the umbrella movement was dispersed. Again, no change, no movement. And then in 2019, the government started getting more aggressive and came up with some legislation that would have allowed people to be extradited very easily to China. This was completely anathema to what the people of Hong Kong have been promised. They've been promised there'd be a firewall, a fire break between the legal system in Hong Kong and the non-legal system in China. Nobody wanted to be, the business community was aghast at this. They didn't want to, I get in a commercial dispute with you and I've got more political power. I get you snatched across the border and you're thrown into a Chinese jail with no recourse. I mean, nobody wanted this. And in the end, there were a whole series of demonstrations, some days as many as 2 million people. Think of that, 2 million people out of a city of 7.5 million people were in the streets. And yet the government refused to budge. There was some violence, mostly against property. There was one person inadvertently, but still was killed, inadvertently or not, the person was dead as a result of some violence by protesters. There was people shot by the police. There was a lot of violence on both sides. And yet, at the end of it, November 2019, 6 out of 10 people voted for the pro-democracy candidates in some ward elections, district council elections. I think this really, really shocked the Chinese Communist Party because they actually, I'm told on good authority, they had articles ready. They were ready to say silent majority, so-called blue wave, supporting the forces of order is, thrown out all these lousy pro-democracy people. And instead, quite the opposite. The Democrats just, because of the weird electoral rules, the Democrats completely crushed and swept and took 16 of the 17 district councils. I think this totally shocked the Chinese Communist Party. I think they just could not take this challenge to their authority. Instead of saying, as many of us in democratic societies would do, okay, lost this election, we'll live to fight another day, we'll go back, change power, Democrats will come to power, we'll have some more. No, they said, wow, this is too scary. And so they put in a national security law in late on the night of June 30th, 2020, so a little less than 3 years ago. Completely imposed by Beijing, which is illegal according to all the promises that they've made. The chief executive of Hong Kong had not even seen the text of the law until a few hours earlier, and it effectively criminalized dissent. So the last, I'm not going to go into great detail, but the last 3 years have, as I said, we've seen about 1,300 political prisoners right now, as of the end of January. 10,000 people or so, and again, the city of 7.5 million have been arrested on political charges. Many people, a couple hundred, have been held without bail because the national security law effectively throws out all the legal protections that China had promised in the Basic Law and in the Sino-British Declaration and in other international treaties. No right to trial by jury. Instead, you have hand-picked judges by the government. No presumption of innocence, so you have no bail in many cases. So I know people, and including some of my colleagues from Apple, who've been held. They've been held, since 2021. So it'll be 2 years this summer. One of them, Jimmy Lai, we can talk about, who's fighting the charges. The other 6 are like, I'm guilty. I just want to plead guilty. Please sentence me. Let me, serve my time and get out. The government is holding them without trial. They won't even sentence them. Because they're holding them hostage to Jimmy Lai in his case. So we've seen all major independent media, led by Apple Daily, which, as Daniel kindly noted, was the largest pro-democracy newspaper, but other smaller independent newspapers, Stand News, Citizen News, online services, many of those people are in jail. There's a big trial going on right now with the Stand News people. Unions have, any pro-democracy unions have been disbanded. Civil society groups have been shut. According to the U.S. the Congressional Executive Commission on China, at least 65 civil societies, NGOs have been shut down or disbanded. I want to spend a little more time talking about Apple Daily. This was a publicly traded company on the stock exchange of Hong Kong. It had a value of about $150 million, and it should have been subject to, any kind of governance, the rule of law. That's what we thought. We were directors and we were playing by the rules. And one day we get a letter in June 2021, we get a letter from a guy named John Lee, who at the time was Secretary for Security. He's now the Chief Executive of Hong Kong. And he said, he told the directors he had reason to believe, think of these three words, he had reason to believe that our company had violated the national security law. No evidence, didn't even mention one article, one thing that we had done, but he had reason to believe it, therefore he's freezing our bank accounts. So you go from a city that's a global financial center that prides itself on rule of law, you know, the government wins some, people win some, you lose some, to one man who can just write you a letter and put your company out of business and freeze your assets. He froze Jimmy Lai's assets, the founder, as well. And we, in the end, about 1,000 people lost their jobs. Hong Kong lost, great newspaper. And we've still never seen any evidence. It's never been proven in court that we've never been taken in court. We, as directors, have been investigated. I actually don't know the status of the ongoing investigations, but there are at least 4 different investigations into us as directors. Like it's our fault that the company went out of business, despite the fact that our bank accounts were frozen. We couldn't pay our staff. We couldn't buy ink. We couldn't pay for the phone bill. We couldn't pay for the electricity bill. It goes on. And so I think one of the things that we've done at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation is to fund research. And we talk about a little more in the Q&A, but we're funding some research that's coming out soon. It's independent, but it's interesting. It's trying to look at the role of Hong Kong as a global financial center. And I think that businesses are going to have to reconsider the risk-reward ratio of a place like Hong Kong, because it had rule of law. It had pretty much what a London or a New York would have, and it was one of the 3 major financial centers of the world. Hong Kong's bet is that you can put people like Jimmy Lai in jail, you can put people you don't like in jail, and the JP Morgans and the Goldman Sachs of the world are going to say, it's okay, I'm fine, I'm not like that, it won't affect me. But I would argue, and again, I'm happy to get into this in the Q&A, that a number of issues relating to national security law, relating to data privacy, data integrity, are going to start affecting businesses, whether it's the government demanding and companies having to give financial data to authorities, a Google or a search engine being told to give up information on searches. And I think there's a much higher degree of risk than many in the business community have realized. However, the U.S. State Department, in fact, has come out with a business advisory on Hong Kong, but I think that's, it'll be interesting to see our research and the reaction to that. So I'll just finish with about 5 minutes or so talking a little bit more about the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, so you get a little more tangible sense of how our notion of trying to put human rights at the center of U.S.-China policy is actually working in the real world. So our goal is to hold China accountable for its broken promises, the ones that I talked about. We do this by working through 3 different areas, through governments, through, I guess, media and through civil society. So we have offices in Washington and London. We engage extensively with elected representatives as well as with the governments itself. And so I kind of distinguish between senators and congressmen and then like State Department, Treasury Department, National Security Council, but we engage with all of them. We do similar work in the UK, both in England and Scotland. We intend to be more active in Europe starting this year. We are trying to keep Hong Kong in the spotlight. It's a big world. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of human rights abuses, not only in China, but around the world. So, as I say, we testify or engage formally and informally with Parliament, U.S. Congress. So that's kind of the first bucket with government. With media, well, I'm a recovering journalist. A lot of us are involved with media. So we write, we talk, we try to be as active as we can. And we kind of on a related, I guess, this kind of public opinion bucket, we do fund research. We've looked at Confucius Institutes in the UK and their involvement there because, as I think many of you know, a lot of Hong Kongers have gone to the UK. It's very easy for them to get a visa that will quickly lead to citizenship, given the former colonial ties between Hong Kong and Britain. So I think about 140,000 plus have gone since the national security law came in 2020. We've been very concerned about the harassment, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of Chinese, but especially Hong Kong diaspora people have endured. And so that's our research on some of the links with the Confucius Institute and the United Front links in the UK. Just in terms of other public things, one of our advisors is Professor Perry Link, UC Riverside, formerly at Princeton. He's nominated, as you may know, Daniel, academics are eligible to nominate people for the Nobel Peace Prize, and Perry has led a group of more than, I think it's 15 academics from more than a dozen countries nominating five different Hong Kong activists. That's a way of, again, trying to keep Hong Kong in the spotlight, trying to keep the human components, the human rights components. We actually have some interesting activities around women prisoners that will be focused on International Women's Day in 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. We, along with other activists, have worked to try to get protections for Hong Kongers who are in the US, whether they've gotten asylum or they're trying to stay here. So there's a program called Delayed Enforced Departure, which allowed people to, Hong Kongers specifically, to stay in the US while they try to work out a political or passport or visa situation. And the Biden administration, to our great happiness, just extended that for 2 years earlier, effective earlier this month. We are really trying to focus as much as possible on individual political prisoners. So there's a campaign going, there's essentially a show trial going on right now of 47 Hong Kong political prisoners. Their crime was, they're really some of the best and the brightest people of the city, fantastic people. Most of them were elected politicians or involved in politics. Their crime was to hold an election primary to try to get the best candidates to take part in the city council election. And for that, most of them have been sitting in jail without bail for 2 years. And on the third side, I guess we're just kind of a little more activist. I should say, also on the government side, we believe in sanctions. We believe in punishment. We have carrots and sticks. There have been sanctions. We do think that individual bad actors should pay a price. So judges and prosecutors who are prosecuting national security law cases are certainly people that we're paying more attention to. And of course, we can't do anything ourselves, but we can engage with governments to try to make individuals pay a price. That in itself is not going to be enough to change behavior. I think we have to be realistic about that. But we are engaged in that on a more structural basis. We've engaged with Congress and in an attempt to get them to look harder at and potentially shut down Hong Kong's quasi-diplomatic missions, known as the Economic and Trade Offices, the ETOs. We have one in San Francisco. There's also one in Washington, one in New York. Very happy to see last week both four people, two Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 senators, 2 House members introduced 2 bills, one in the Senate, one in the House, that would pave the way towards the shutdown of these missions, which were set up to underscore Hong Kong's autonomy at a time when it was a more autonomous city, and now have unfortunately become a locus for wolf warrior kind of behavior, trying to intimidate media, as well as trying to, I think, improperly use soft cultural diplomacy to try to convince people that everything is normal in Hong Kong, just a few little problems, a few political prisoners, but don't worry about that because everything's normal. And so we don't think everything's normal in Hong Kong, as I think you probably understand. I think, and I mentioned the third part, which is just trying to, I guess be a more activist in a kind of non-governmental, non-media way. So I think, Linda, we have that, we have a little video. So among other things, we've done a series of large-scale wall projections. So this one's on the Guggenheim Museum, and it's highlighted. That's Xi Jinping. So it's for National Day last year, of course. Hong Kong's yellow umbrella movement. We like to work with Tibetans and Uyghurs, trying to form a communist. That's Jimmy Lai, political prisoner. Who got 14 months in jail for lighting a candle. If any of you know, Winnie the Pooh is a synagogue for Xi Jinping. So yeah, I mean, that was on the Guggenheim, and that gets us a lot of social engagement. It builds a lot of morale and I guess goodwill back in Hong Kong, where people know that they're not forgotten, which is, I think, one of at the heart of it. We need to people in Hong Kong need to understand we haven't forgotten them, whether they're in jail or they're not in jail. I mean, there's still a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, have left Hong Kong. First population decline in the
The next YouTube video, perhaps.
We do have more too, by the way. Yeah, but there's still 7 million. So we had the first population decline since records were actually probably since 1945 during the Japanese occupation in the 40s. But there's still 7 million people there, and I happen to believe that probably 6 out of 10 would vote for a pro-democracy candidate tomorrow if they had a choice. So we're not trying to punish the people of Hong Kong. We do want to make them realize that the world hasn't forgotten them, and they're even more isolated, or they have been, because of COVID and the crazy Chinese COVID policies that Hong Kong had to go along with. And so, part of these and some of the other activities we do is just to remind people in Hong Kong that the world hasn't forgotten. So we don't have an army, we don't have we don't have a state behind us, but I think we've got a real focus on human rights, and I think a realization that this is a long game and that we're in it for a long time. But I'm old enough to remember the Berlin Wall going up. I lived in Berlin when there was a wall, and now there's no more wall. I have to believe that something similar will happen in China. Nothing stays the same. Could get worse. I hope and believe that with what my colleagues and other committed people around the world are doing, it'll be better in China someday. So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. We now have a sort of decent amount of time for questions, I think 40 minutes. So, we're glad to take your questions. I don't know if you'd like to field questions yourself, or I can moderate. But I might sort of take the prerogative to ask an initial question. So much of what you have to say about your activities, Mark, the activities of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, feels sort of familiar to me as a historian who spent a little bit of time, a while ago, working on the history of human rights mobilization in the 1970s and 1980s. So the idea that you would, create an office in Washington, D.C. and strive to interface with the Congress, with the executive agencies, to try to leverage the United States government as an instrument to promote change within a country that is abusing human rights. That feels familiar. But the difference, I think, is this. In the 1970s, the United States is something of a latecomer to an international human rights mobilization. Amnesty International will open a Washington, D.C. office in 1974, but that comes after a decade of institution building outside the United States. What you described seems to me much more U.S. centered. And I'm sort of curious about how you see the prospects for mobilization on behalf of human rights in Hong Kong outside of the United States, especially in Europe. Is there a danger that you're able to build a consensus within the United States as to the necessity of action, but that the Europeans don't come on board? And that the possibility for actually affecting change in China is sort of significantly curtailed because the movement is not a global movement, but a U.S. movement. And I'm sure this is a concern for you, and I'd love to hear more about sort of how you plan to build a truly multilateral movement.
Yeah, fantastic question. It's been, I guess, for kind of probably historical reasons. I mean, the UK has this very close relationship with Hong Kong. The Hong Kong diaspora in the UK is huge. In fact, we opened in the UK first. I'm an American, and the U.S. is, I think, uniquely well positioned to move on this. But as I alluded to, we have a European strategy and campaign that's going to be more active. We've been there. What is interesting to me is 3 years ago or so, the EU was on the verge of signing a trade investment agreement, far-reaching one, that been negotiated over many years. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was one of Angela Merkel's we already wanted to be a signature achievement. And kind of a week or two later, China sanctioned many of those same parliamentarians who would have voted in favor of, would have had to vote for on this. So, and in the most, I mentioned Wang Yi's meeting with Blinken in Munich earlier. This was last week. You know, the Chinese don't seem to be doing themselves any favors. So, it is a concern. It's really been a matter of bandwidth and time that we haven't done more in Europe. And as I say, we intend to. But the Chinese seem to be making our life, paving the road for us. So in a way, it's been okay to be waited because the situation seems to be ripening. So, for example, a little country of Lithuania, which had the temerity to open a Taiwan trade office, and they used the word Taiwan, the CCP went nuts. Not only cut off, they didn't cut off imports from Lithuania. They just zeroed Lithuania out of their entire import regime. So there was no country classification for Lithuania. It didn't exist. They would tell people, no, we can stop the imports from Lithuania. I mean, they tried to kill this tiny little country, crush it. And then they told German automakers that they couldn't even get parts from Lithuania anymore. And that backfired on them. I think, you know, you had a number of countries, of Czechoslovakia being one, that had inked that had burgeoning economic relationships with China that seemed to have gone nowhere, and with some different governments in actually seem to be rolled back. So Germany, of course, is if I can get a little granular, I mean, Germany is the key country, and the German automakers in particular, German industry in general, has been, China's been an extremely important market, and that's kind of understating it. On the other hand, the feedback that we're getting from our initial trips on the ground is there's a lot of movement at a lower level, including in the Bundestag and throughout civil society, the business community, and the very top echelons of the government. Scholz just made a visit to Beijing, are still resisting to change, but I kind of feel that the momentum is building for change. So it's a big question. It's an important question. You have Chinese investment, particularly in ports, Rotterdam, if I remember correctly, Piraeus, of course, in Greece. So there's a lot of economic activity, and you know, it's touch and go, but it's an important question. Or was there a question though? Oh no, okay, sorry.
So I'm intrigued by the practicality of centering human rights in U.S.-China relations, and I remember during the Hong Kong protests that there was just kind of a shrug, and there's just like very little vocal support for the protesters relative to, I think, other areas in which we've seen a lot of protests. And one of the things that seems to be still dominant now under the Biden administration is this notion that we have to clean up our own domestic politics before we can engage in this sort of thing abroad. I don't agree with that point, but I'm really curious to hear what you're hearing about how we can do both a lot of domestic political stuff and foreign policy for the middle class and blah, 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 and increase what's happening in sort of
legitimate point. I mostly hear when I read the Chinese state media, who has a lot to say about U.S. human rights, and it's like, okay, more power to them, you know. And if I'd love to see us do more in our own country. I don't hear that a lot from activists, you know, engaging with China, because in the general perception would be as bad it is as it. Whatever imperfections there might be in liberal open societies, it's just qualitatively different than in a place where any kind of government doesn't like you or what you're doing, or they think you might have tested positive for COVID or whatever. You just have absolutely no protection as an individual. And I think people who dealt with both systems understand the qualitative difference in that. So
I don't actually just mean it about human rights. I mean it about democracy. Democracy means we have less moral authority locally.
You know, I somehow that doesn't seem to be. I mean, sitting here in the States, we might feel that, but somehow when you're in Hong Kong or in China or in a lot of the world, in Asia, I think people are like, wow, any help we can get, we'll take it. I mean, you've got your problems, that's fine. You know, the number of American flags being waved in the Hong Kong protest was truly staggering. And by the way, Donald Trump would have won hands down in Hong Kong and probably in Taiwan if there were an election. Whatever the,
What is the actual status now of the pro-democracy movement within Hong Kong? So I haven't heard too much since the demonstrations ended. Is there still sort of an ongoing effort, or are they just feeling too controlled?
I think people are basically dealing with their friends who are going through the court processes right now. And so people are, trying to help people who are in jail, trying to help them in their legal things. There are no demonstrations. I mean, COVID, it's one of these things that like if it hadn't existed, they would have had to invent it because they stopped, as you probably know, there were Hong Kong was the only place on Chinese soil where the June 4th killings could be commemorated, the Tiananmen killings. And I was at the last one in 2019, huge crowd, almost well over 150,000 people. And that was the last year it was held. In 2020. That's what Jimmy Lai went to jail for. He came, he didn't say a thing. He lit a candle, he got back in his car and left. And they said that was incitement to riot. They said you couldn't have because he was a public figure, and therefore if you were lighting a candle that other people might riot. So I mean, they're really like not messing around, and people who do things that nobody who would have noticed a couple of years ago are being hauled off on national security law or NSL type charges. They brought back sedition charges, which are a British colonial statute which hadn't been used, I think, since 1967, and was very, very rarely used. And so essentially they criminalized dissent. Interestingly, you may know that I guess it was late November, there were the so-called A4 protests in China where people held up blank pieces of paper. That happened in Hong Kong. It was some mainland students at the University of Hong Kong who held up the blank piece of paper. No Hong Kongers would they felt that the mainlanders were going to be treated more leniently by the Hong Kong police, but there wasn't any solidarity and they didn't join. So I do know of individual acts of resistance, like just little posters and little kind of resistance things, but I mean, it's so small as to do not. I mean, it does allow the government to say we still need to be a threat and we still need to keep cracking down, but there's nothing real going on. I mean, you couldn't have 10 people at a demonstration, and the fact that there's still COVID restrictions on gatherings, I think makes it very convenient. I can't remember what the limit is. I think it's 6 or 8 people.
I have a bunch of questions you can address or not.
Okay.
If you wish, you mentioned the diaspora,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering how organized diaspora is. In the UC system, where there have been efforts to draw together something of a network of people interested in Hong Kong. Then you work with Doi Hua at all? John Cam?
I'm actually meeting him tomorrow. I haven't seen him for a long time. I don't work with him now. I mean, I knew him from Hong Kong, but yeah. And
the role of the press club, I know there's been a lot of effort to suppress.
Yeah.
And then, and on Taiwan, I gather that Taiwan has not been very welcoming to, you did have initially the people who were fleeing Hong Kong, I guess in 2019, 2020. Yeah. But then the situation in Taiwan, I gather, is it's not open armed, welcoming.
You sound like you're informed on a very granular level. Look, I'll start with the Taiwan thing. I probably don't know more than you, but I did just meet somebody last week who's a Hong Kong journalist here on a fellowship who's moving to Taiwan at the end of this month. So it's not closed, but I've heard much the same thing you have. And I think there's a lot of fear about Chinese spies being infiltrated. That's their excuse. But, there still are a lot of Hong Kong people in Taiwan and a lot who want to move there. So, I just don't know. But I've heard much the same thing. It's like they say it's open arms, but it's really been a lot more difficult. I'll just go backwards. The FCC, I was a board member. It was a great club. I think they just chickened out, and I don't know what happened. I know former president. I know a lot of people are very, very disappointed because it looked to many of us who were kind of on the outside but had been involved that it was self-censorship. It was trying to anticipate what authorities would want. As any of you who've been to Hong Kong might or might not know, there's a beautiful building. It's leased it's not a market rate, but it's not free either, but it's leased on concessionary terms. And it's a government building, and there was always the fear that the government at the end of the lease period would take it back. I think if that were the reason they did that, that would be really sad, because I think that you should, the press club should stand up for human rights principles and free speech in particular. So that's really disappointing. I don't know if it'll ever really recover. It's going to be a long time till it recovers from that kind of loss of credibility. Wei Hua, I mean, it's interesting. John Camp, for those who don't know, was the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, president or chairman at the time of the Tiananmen killings, tried to work for engagement with China. But in the end, ended up founding this group that's working for the release of political prisoners in China, and has had some success over the years. I think, I'll be interested to talk to John, but we probably take a much more public and much more confrontational stance than he would. He's, kind of long marched through the institutions, meeting officials, and I think we're much more like, under Xi Jinping, there's one guy who makes the decisions. I'm probably not meeting him. Even if I did, I probably wouldn't change his mind. So let's think about something asymmetric. And but I have enormous regard for John. He's been doing this for 30 years. He's a MacArthur Fellow. So it's great. The diaspora, maybe we can talk more offline. I mean, I'm obviously not a Hong Konger. I'm not married to a Hong Konger. I don't have any connections there except for, the personal connections I talked about. But I've met a huge number of Hong Kong diaspora activists, both in the UK and in the US, and I am impressed that they are increasingly organized. But, it's really tough to hold the diaspora together. I mean, you think of, white Russians in the 20s or Hungarians after 56. It's hard. However, the numbers and the technological changes that we've seen in recent years make things possible. There was a great summit of Hong Kong activists in Washington in July. There's one that's coming up next month in the UK of many hundreds of people who in turn are representing organizations that are much larger. And it's interesting because the demographic is interesting. Most are in their 20s or 30s. A lot of them were elected officials in Hong Kong, and a lot of their colleagues are in jail. So they actually kind of know what parliamentary or political power is about. They're not just like people who were kids on the street. I don't mean to sound demeaning about that, but they have different sort of levels of experience, and just really interesting group of people, and there are a lot of them, and I wish them well. There's more of a concentrated mass or a critical mass in the UK than there is in the US. And the UK is smaller, a lot more Hong Kongers, so that might make it easier for organizing in the UK.
Do you have any particular policies or bills that the committee or other Hong Kong activists that are kind of pushing for in the US right now?
Yeah, I mentioned this one about we're not lobbyists, so we don't really push for bills. We were happy that our ideas about the economic and trade offices were taken up by in a bipartisan way. We would like to do more work on sanctions for individuals. And actually, you can look on our website. We just released a policy roadmap to help the people of Hong Kong. So there's some specific immigration provisions in there. I do think it'll be interesting, once our report on Hong Kong as a global financial center is released, and do some more work on that. I think Hong Kong may face increased scrutiny for its role in money laundering. I mean, that's kind of always been part of Hong Kong's attraction, is its place kind of come and go without a lot of scrutiny. That was kind of okay from Washington's perspective. Well, it wasn't okay during the Korean War. So I mean, Hong Kong was really badly hurt in the early 50s. Then Eisenhower secretly agreed to protect Hong Kong at a time when Britain was pulling back east of Suez, gave up on east of Suez after the Suez crisis in the late 50s. U.S. got more involved in kind of looking at Hong Kong as a kind of bulwark, an anti-communist bulwark. But I think now that might flip back again, where they're going to see Hong Kong not as a friendly kind of laundry, but as an unfriendly one. So Hong Kong and Macau have been very important in laundering for North Korea, for Iran, I think increasingly for Russia, so, and for Myanmar, for Burma. So I do think there's going to be increased attention to that. That's not something, again, we're not writing bills, but we will fund research, we will promote research, we'll promote ideas, and I think taking a much harder look at Hong Kong's role in evading sanctions and in, basically helping people that we in the US would regard as bad actors is something we'll see a lot more attention on. So take one small but very tangible example, a sanctioned Russian oligarch, Alexei Mordashov, had his mega yacht sailed into Hong Kong, and John Lee, the boss of Hong Kong, said, we're not going to enforce sanctions. We're not going to enforce US sanctions. Like, why he had to do that, it just seems like it's a real challenge to the US, and I think it's something that's going to attract a lot more attention from Washington. So, yeah, but take a look on the website for some other specifics. I have a question.
Hi, Dr. Clifford. So thank you for all, first of all, for great insight. My name's Will. I'm actually a member of the Hong Kong Affairs Association at Berkeley. And we're actually a group of activists / scholars that are interested in the Hong Kong issues and how do we bring about, proceed with the democratization of in Hong Kong. So actually, I have two questions. First, of all is how much direct consequence or efficiency do you see in your work in the Freedom for Hong Kong Committee? Since it always seems to me that there is a gap between research or critique on the China's policy in Hong Kong and the actual implementation, let's say businesses getting out of Hong Kong or not investing in Hong Kong and China in the future. So there's always this gap that seems to me that it's say China's opening up again and its GDP or exports are going up again, and this world is hugely globalized, industrialized. It's pretty difficult for businesses to throw away the price advantage in China and then move to somewhere else, right? And also the second one would be do you have any advice for local student organizations like us that would say in the direction of engaging with local representatives in the US for pushing for more Hong Konger protection or granting legal status bills to do you have any recommendations for us?
I mean, the two fantastic, thanks, and thanks for your work. I mean, two really interesting questions. Look, I think in any political work, there's always, especially if you're an activist, there's always a huge gap, right? And so you look at so it's from us to a government, and from the government to then affect what actually happens in China or happens in the real world. Those are really big gaps, right? So I started, maybe I'm lucky because I'm a lot older than you. I started at Berkeley 48 years ago, I guess, this September, 1975, September. And as I said, the Berlin Wall was up then, and it's not anymore. And nobody saw that coming. I mean, nobody. You go back and read, there are a few people claim they predicted it, but nobody saw it coming. Not even a couple months earlier. I mean, that was 1989. At the time of the Tiananmen killings, I was just looking at this book called "Getting China Wrong" by Aaron Friedberg, very interesting, by Princeton. During the Tiananmen killings, I mean, the U.S. then sent all these people to China to try to say, "Don't worry, it's going to be fine between the U.S. and China." And okay, we're sorry you killed those people, but don't worry. Because the U.S. still thought it needed China against the Soviet Union. And, 6 months later, the Berlin Wall is down. So nobody ever sees change coming. So it can be very discouraging. But I think, again, one of the things about being older is you just realize, history is long, history changes in strange ways and can change. And nothing happens and then things happen very fast. Nobody predicted the umbrella uprising in Hong Kong. The night before the 2003 demonstration, that had 500,000 people against Article 23. The Chinese, Tung Chee-hwa, the head of Hong Kong, was telling the local PRC officials 25,000 people are going to come out. 500,000 people came out. That's like a government that doesn't even know what's going on. So I think I'd love to be out of business tomorrow. I would like nothing more than just like everybody's out of prison, Jimmy Lai's out of prison, there's democracy in Hong Kong. I don't know, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, but I feel like I'm on the right side of history, right, for me personally. For students, I mean, maybe we can just exchange and talk offline, because I mean, there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of diaspora groups. I mean, it's hard for me to tell you what to do, but I would say, if you can engage with your representatives, particularly, I would say on the House of Representatives rather than state representatives, it's good because, people notice when their voters take the trouble to engage with them on something. It's pretty easy if you're in Washington or they're out here to meet with them. I mean, when people actually look face to face at people, they have a different reaction. I heard a story recently where Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastian, was visiting the United Kingdom. He was meeting a really small group of MPs and people from the House of Lords. And then one of them said, I think it was a guy named Ian Duncan Smith, said, "Oh, I have to go down, it's Prime Minister's question time." They called on him. He asked the Prime Minister about Jimmy Lai. All of a sudden, wow, only because Sebastian Lai had just been talking to him. And all of a sudden the Prime Minister has to respond. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen, but the British government has not done what it should in terms of consular protection. Chinese, of course, say he's born in China, he's always Chinese, you don't have any rights. And the Prime Minister was put on the spot, and that was because 5 minutes earlier, the MP had been talking to Jimmy's son. So I think when people really meet real people and can understand, it's not an abstract thing, it's not something to read in the New York Times, but it's somebody who can explain to them the reality of Hong Kong. It's very powerful.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I am a part of this church that was actually founded in China, and our founder died a martyr under Mao Zedong. And they have many churches here in the US, but ever since they started cracking down on Protestantism in China, they don't necessarily meet as regularly or as openly. And so this fall will actually be an exchange student in the University of Hong Kong. And I kind of wanted to conduct research on religious freedom. I just wanted to know what type of suggestions you would have.
First of all, I think that's great. I think that if you don't have a Chinese passport, I think that's, or a Hong Kong passport, I think you're more protected. I don't quite know what to say in terms of, you should just make sure you have the numbers of the US consulate there. I mean, you could get in serious trouble, but I think it's worth trying whatever you can do. Hong Kong is undergoing more and more religious persecution right now. We have to be honest about this. Bishop Zen, a very brave man, 90 years old, they just arrested him. I mean, he's not in prison right now, but the fact that they would do that is, cool, just beyond belief. One of the top PRC, CCP officials in Hong Kong right now, Sha Baolong, made his career, busting up churches in Zhejiang, destroying churches. So, these are the kind of people you have running Hong Kong. I mean, there's a lot of surveillance on the church. It kind of comes and goes, and you can do more research and see in terms of the hierarchies in the church. And I mean, you're not Catholic. The Catholic Church is very important, but both Protestants and Catholics are under increasing amounts of pressure in Hong Kong. So I would say, great, go ahead and do it, but please keep your eyes open and make sure you've got the phone number of the consulate. I'm not joking about that. They will help you and you'll be okay, but you have to be prepared that it's not like being in Berkeley.
Thank you.
There are many people now who are questioning the effectiveness of economic pressure or economic coercion for let's say dealing with China or other dictators. For example, an example that is frequently brought up is that let's say in the 90s, I mean, the US also had a lot of economic sanctions against the CCP back then after the Tiananmen killings, and more recently after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are also a lot of economic sanctions, which many question the effectiveness. For example, many people say it's more like sanctioning ourselves than sanctioning them due to the energy crisis that followed. So what would be your response to people's questions on the effectiveness of.
Look, I think they're good and legitimate questions, and sanctions are a very, very imperfect tool, and often they don't work. So they worked for, and I'm not an expert in this area. Sometimes they have to be done because not to do them would be wrong. So say take imports of Xinjiang cotton. If we believe, which I do, the very credible reports of forced labor and worse in Xinjiang, I just don't think it would be like buying slave cotton or something like that. I mean, we just wouldn't want to do that, even if we have to pay $1 or more a shirt. Sometimes you have to do the right thing. I had a long discussion this morning with an old friend who, I don't know if you're aware, there's something called CFIUS, which looks at foreign investments into the US. There's now a proposal in Congress to look at US investments into China. My friend, who's a big finance guy, thinks this is crazy. It's a tax on America. But then I say, well, if you look at how China behaved during COVID, and China's continued willingness to use economic levers and coercion, whether it's on rare earths or other products or PPE products during COVID, well, just for your own self-insurance, self-protection, why would you want to have to be dependent on China for all these things? And yes, you might pay a little bit more, but for your own kind of resilience and long-term survival, you at least need to diversify your supply chain. And that's a little different than the sanctions issue. But I don't know, like you look at the deal that Apple has made in China. I mean, cheap Chinese labor, big Chinese market has, made Apple one of the most valuable companies in the world. How do you disentangle that? I don't know. But if I'm right that we're headed for a deepening confrontation with China, don't we want to at least start thinking about disentangling? Again, that's separate from sanctions. Sanctions have had very limited, I think, impact throughout history, and usually under pretty specific circumstances. So, you need to think carefully. We need to think carefully about them. We need to be realistic about what the actual outcome is going to be. I think people get frustrated because they think, oh, I'm going to sanction a specific person, or we'll do a specific thing, and then things are just going to change. And I mean, look, we've had sanctions on Cuba for most of the past 60-something years, and I don't see a lot of change there.
Yeah. So we are now in a digitalized world, like everything we receive, like news, a lot of news, like overwhelming news. So with the flood of news, like from Ukraine, from like Syria, from Turkey, people are starting to get a lot of news, and they're starting to get numb about what happened. Especially in Hong Kong, some of my friends I know, they're scared, and they don't even know like the legislators, like in trial, like it's a kind of big thing.
The Hong Kong 47
Yeah.
I talked about, yeah.
But then no one knows it. They just know about other stuff, because what they are flooded with is like local state news,
Sure.
So my question is, how can you actually like overcome this obstacle? Because people are tired, people are numb. So what do you think like we can do about that?
Yeah, no, I guess it's a great question. As I said, one of our great challenges is to ensure that Hong Kong is not forgotten. And I've laid out our strategy for how we do things, and it's tiring. I mean, let's be honest. I'm in London a lot, in Washington a lot. My colleagues and I try to go out and we use every opportunity we have. We show movies and talk with groups about it. We do big events, we do small events, we do grassroots things, we do congressional things. Haven't met the president or anybody like that yet. Although I just talked to Mike Pence last week, because he's, he was a huge supporter of Jimmy Lyons, still is. So, you try to do everything, but it's a big world. We've got 8 billion people in the world. There are a lot of problems, and there are places that are a lot worse off than Hong Kong. We have to be honest about that. So I think we try to keep pushing in every way you can, and we just hope that historical circumstances change in a way that makes our kind of change possible. So I look at China right now, and although I've laid out a very negative picture about my feeling about the Chinese Communist Party's disregard for individual humans, individual freedoms, human rights, I don't think that China's a monolith. I don't think China will never change. There are many people in China who like reform, and there are a lot, we saw it during the COVID protests. A lot of people just like had enough. How is that going to manifest itself? I mean, I don't know. I look at the Chinese economy. It's something I look at really closely. It's a very, very troubled economy. I mean, we talked about trouble in the US, but I mean, I think we were talking more about democracy, but also, we have our challenges economically, but I look at, China's massive buildup in debt, its huge focus, reliance on the property sector and infrastructure sector. It's squashing of the private sector of some of the most dynamic entrepreneurs in the country, people like Jack Ma. I used to be a member of the Asia Business Council. I mean, a great guy, and basically practically disappeared him. You look at this guy from China Renaissance, one of the star bankers of China, again, just disappeared. You look at China's, squelching of creativity, innovation, openness, and you just say, hey, China, and of course you look at demographic, you look at the big long-term problems that they face, and it's not like a slam dunk. This is like China's century or something. I personally think, I don't like to predict things, I'm a historian, but I do think this is a particularly challenging period, the 2020s. I don't know, I somehow have a feeling after 2030, as China ages and it has to start worrying, it's the whole demographic dividend that it got over the last, 4 or 5 decades is finished. And China's going to really have to worry about an aging society. It's going to get, as many people have said, it'll get old before it gets rich. Its growth rate is plummeting. I mean, China is going to probably be growing at more like 2 or 3% over this decade. Forget about 5%, let alone 6 or 8%. And so that means that its goals of overtaking the US, even though it's just a number, but China's really wanted to overtake the US. Xi Jinping wants to overtake the US in economic size. I mean, I think that dream is just receding further and further into the future. It's been pushed off 10 years already to the late 2030s, the late 2020s. So, I think we just keep working, keep the faith, keep the spotlight, but especially on the individuals. I didn't talk too much about Jimmy Lai, but here's a guy I've known for 30 years. He's 75 years old. He's a Roman Catholic. Many students thought he was, too moderate, too nonviolent. But he's in solitary confinement. I mean, solitary confinement in a maximum security prison. And it's not just Jimmy, and at least he's in Hong Kong. Think of the people who are in, Chinese prisons. I mean, the conditions that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the Canadian hostages who were taken. I mean, I think it really works to focus on individuals. And so that's one of our initiatives for this coming year. And as I said, around International Women's Day, you'll see some focus specifically. There are a lot of women political prisoners, as you know. On a related note, Hong Kong is the highest percentage of women incarcerated people of any territory or country in the world. Its overall incarceration is low, but it's the percentage. Women are about 20%, which is very high. I think it's 20%. So just keep going. I mean, that's all. There's no. If there were a magic solution, I wouldn't have to be here talking to you today, and I'd be out of a job, right? Which would be a good thing. Yeah.
I have a question actually. I don't know if you're familiar with the A4 movement.
Sure.
And do you think that the A4 movement played an important role during the lockdown? And there are some Twitter accounts rise after the A4 movement, and they really gained a lot of attention. And do you think that we can, people from China mainland can gain power and restart the movements through those Twitter accounts?
Yeah, you're talking about the A4 movement in China, in the mainland, right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for those of you who don't know, I alluded to it before, the fire in Urumqi, which killed so many people, and then people came out on the streets of Shanghai and other cities and held up blank pieces of paper. That was hugely important. And when Xi Jinping's rule is done, maybe the Chinese Communist Party is consigned to the dustbin of history, maybe we'll look back and this will be a real turning point because first of all, it forced complete flip-flop, complete 180-degree turn on the part of Xi Jinping, right? He's supposed to be an all-knowing, all-wise, leader, And he had to go from zero COVID to COVID everywhere, almost overnight, right? And so it showed that there was a lot of resistance and that they were worried about kind of losing control of society. So I think it's huge. I'm a little less optimistic that Twitter and other social media things. I mean, I hope I'm proven wrong, but you know, the Chinese government has been so adept at using technology to keep people swatched down that, I mean, it's a real cat and mouse game, but you know, as you know, on Weibo and other things, I mean, things are shut down pretty quickly. So I haven't, you know, even with the A4 movement, they've gone back and used their surveillance technology to, you know, go back and pick up some of those people and threaten them and, you know, make them scared. They probably aren't going to do it again, but I don't know. So it's a, you know, it's a double-edged thing, but I think the A4 movement, that nobody saw that coming, and it completely changed Chinese policy like almost overnight. So very, very important.
I want to sort of try to bring this to a conclusion on a positive note. So let's try this. So we've got, you know, students here who are in their early 20s. Are you optimistic that they will, in their lifetimes, see real political change in Hong Kong and in China?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's very rare. I mean, well, you probably know the data on this better than me. It's very rare that authoritarian governments can really keep control indefinitely. I mean, so the CCP has already outlived the US, the Soviet Union, by a couple of years. But yeah, I don't know, because we are in this particular world, especially because of digital technology and surveillance technology. But it's hard to imagine, you know, on the other hand, I lived in Korea and I didn't think North Korea was going to last this long. And the conventional wisdom among, for example, the US ambassador at the time was, you know, somewhere between 2 weeks and 2 years after Kim Il-sung dies, the junior will be out of, things will change. And here we are on the grandson now, and it's 40 years later. So 30 years later. So, you have to be optimistic, and I think, you know, I mean, hope is not a strategy, but it does keep you going. And I just think, you know, history throws up strange things, and that's what's so fun about it. And it's, you know, I have to say, is, you know, as sad, you know, I guess on a hopeful note, I mean, as sad, as heartbreaking as it is for me to see, you know, a free, prosperous, open city destroyed, smashed, almost overnight. The people that I've met through my work and the Hong Kongers, the spirit of resistance in Hong Kong, the nurturing of a Hong Kong identity, of Cantonese language, of all of, you know, the CCP has actually forged a much stronger Hong Kong identity. So, for example, 10 years ago, there was no pro-independence movement in Hong Kong. And then at one point it was 20% or so. Who created that? The CCP, right? So, you know, it is this dialectical process. And I think by the time this CCP goes away, Hong Kong itself, whether you have a federal system in China or whatever it is, I used to think Hong Kong independence was crazy. Politically, it still is crazy, but there's no reason like economically or socially or politically it couldn't work. It's 7.5 million people. It's about the median for, there are about as many countries larger than Hong Kong as smaller. You know, there's a lot of countries of 7 million people. So, yeah, I don't know. I've been really, really encouraged by the spirit of resistance, getting back to one of the earlier questions that continues in Hong Kong and of course abroad. So we'll see. I mean, as again, that question, diasporas are hard to sustain, but there's a lot of momentum. And of course, people aren't going to just forget about China. You know, it's hard to keep Hong Kong in the frame, but it's impossible not to have China in the frame.
And here, I suppose we might make some concluding analogies of the situation in Ukraine, right, where you see a free society that has been put under enormous pressure by an antagonistic authoritarian adversary. And what has resulted is an invigoration of the resiliency and the vitality and the self-belief of the free society.
And throughout the world, I mean, especially in Europe, I think, you know, look at Poland, Czechoslovakia, I mean, you know, not everywhere in Europe, but a lot of people understand that this is for real. And, you know, don't you kind of ignore or take for granted freedom at your peril, especially when you're in the neighborhood next to Russia and next to China.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Am I helping from
I don't know if anybody else.
Oh.